Thanks, Mark, and thank you to the Frist Center. I'm really happy about this show. I can honestly say this is the nicest installation I've ever seen for my work. It's a beautiful space, and they've done a great job hanging it, so I couldn't be more pleased. I just want to give a brief introduction about sort of how I got into this line of work, so to speak. I was painting in my studio in 2003, and I was working on a large painting about the Vietnam War, which I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember as a child. I grew up in the liberal Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my mother would drag me along to protest marches in the Boston Common. And I remember seeing pictures of the war in Life magazine, and that war always loomed large in my mind, and I finally got around. I always thought I might try to make some paintings about it. So I'm making this large painting, and I'm listening to the radio, and you guys may remember that we were getting ready for the invasion of Iraq. So this sort of drumbeat for war. Reporters were lining up to get embedded, and this was kind of this new thing. It's really biggest experiment since Vietnam. They're going to put the reporters in with the troops and kind of see how it went. I suddenly thought in my studio, I could go as an artist and draw what I saw. I don't know why it came to me so late, because at that point the whole embedding process was kind of sewn up, and they said, sorry, we don't have any room for you. But the bee was in my bonnet, so I talked to my wife, my patient wife sitting over there, who's also an artist. We always had this sort of agreement that we would sacrifice what we had to for our art, so she couldn't say no, really. And I got a plane for Kuwait. I met a couple of French reporters there. I was kind of trying to figure out how to get into Iraq. And one day, Jean-Michel, who wrote for a French newspaper, says, Steve, me and my buddy were driving to Baghdad. Do you want to come? And I said, yes. When are you leaving? He said, in an hour. So I grabbed my stuff, got in the rented car, and we crossed the border. We got to Basra, which was the southern Iraqi city that the British had fought to take. It had fallen already. They found the local hospital, which was barricaded. The staff had protected it against looters with basically wielding 2x4s. And it was filled with mostly women and children, some of whom had been wounded in the fighting, many of whom were just malnourished. So these two reporters were in their element. They started doing what reporters do, and I had a camera, and I began taking photographs. And I suddenly realized it felt like I was masquerading. I was pretending to be some sort of reporter that I wasn't. I had no place to send these photographs. There didn't seem to be any point in me taking photographs. And I thought, boy, I'm in the wrong place. I gotta go back. And I went outside to think about it. And I realized that I couldn't go back. There was no bus service from Basra to Kuwait. I was stuck all the way to Baghdad. And so I realized I'd better try to do what I thought I was going to do at the beginning, which was to draw. So I kind of screwed up my nerve, and I went in there and began to draw. The first drawings were bad and shaky, but I needed to break the ice. I needed to kind of convince myself that even though I was a civilian and an artist, there was still a legitimate role for me. I made, 6 trips to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan, and every single trip I went through kind of a period of having to reconvince myself that it was okay as an artist to be there, and that I had as much right to be there as contractors or protesters or NGOs or reporters. And the only way I could do that was actually by sitting down and drawing what was in front of me. Me and these 2 reporters kind of wound our way up to Baghdad, and it took us, I'm going to guess, around a week. The city had fallen at that point to the American Army and the Marines. And so we arrived in this city that seemed to be empty of security. I mean, here and there we saw some Americans, but when we got there, I kind of walked around. I had to find a hotel because there was no room at the inn where the French were staying. And so I found a flea bag hotel, and I just set out with my sketch pad, and I probably walked for 4 hours through downtown without seeing a single American soldier. The city was quiet at that point, sort of the midday, kind of had a feeling of a siesta. And eventually I ran across a squad of Americans that were set up on the street, and they were guarding a bank. And I said, where's your unit? And they told me where it was. So the next day I set out. There were taxis buzzing all over Baghdad, most of them just private citizens with cars that were trying to make a few extra bucks. The Iraqi sense of direction is weird. They don't use north, south, west, and east very usually. They locate by, oh, that's just to the left of such and such mosque or such and such square. So whenever I would get in an Iraqi taxi and look for an American base, we'd always do this multi-hour kind of circling around, asking every tea seller, you know. But eventually we found this old electric company where this was a company from 3rd Infantry Division was situated. And so I got a taxi. I go up there. There's a guy at the razor wire. I tell him I'm American. He says, oh, okay, lets me in. I said, where's the commander? There's 2 Bradleys, these big, they look like tanks, kind of idling, engines roaring. And I go up, and the lieutenant colonel who's commanding this base is on top. And he shouts down over the end and says, what are you looking for? And I said, I'm an artist, I want to draw. He says, fine, hop on. And turned out he and his wife had a rent-stabilized apartment in Upper Manhattan, and they were, I wouldn't say he was exactly an art connoisseur, but he was familiar with sort of, you know, the eccentric artists and stuff, and he basically gave me a carte blanche. So every day I would go out there and go patrolling with him and his men. They were basically trying to be an ad hoc police force, but over much too large an area. One day they might stumble upon a bank robbery in progress and basically act like cops and apprehend the suspects. Another day they'd be rounding up people with weapons. They'd go through the streets and Iraqis would greet them with a real mix of some enthusiastic thumbs up, some just totally giving them the hairy eyeball and, you know, obviously pissed off at them. So you could really see it was a city in flux, and you could also see that they didn't have the manpower to do at that point what they were charged to do. Okay, I'm going to go right to the slides now. Slides, that dates me. Okay, whoops, I don't want to join a network. Stubborn. Okay, this was actually the first drawing that I did in sheer panic in Basra. There was a sort of a big university around the hospital. And it's not much. I was in front of some sort of concrete enclosure that had that hole in it, and a couple of women walked by in abayas. And it was just, sometimes that's all you need to do is just commit a pen and ink to paper and kind of get started. Pen and ink is my preferred medium. This was with Third ID. It was 27 was the name of the company. They were part of the invasion force. They had helped in taking the airport in the initial invasion. They were a great bunch of guys. These 2 guys, the gate that they used was actually a Bradley, the fighting vehicle I mentioned. It's like a tank. And these 2 guys were on top with this big, huge machine gun. So they would just roll it in front at night and guard. So I would often spend the night there too. I'd go on night patrols and just wander around and draw whatever the guys were doing. To me, this had a sort of, a poetic quality about sort of the boredom, but also the camaraderie, almost a coziness sometimes. This is a different base, different people also in downtown Baghdad. Now this is April 2003, so again, it's within maybe 2-3 weeks of Baghdad having fallen. Everything is fresh. Every night, Iraqis would approach the razor wire there, and you know they had everything from requests for help to like, my brother-in-law got out of Abu Ghraib. He's got an RPG. You should come and arrest him. One night, a drunk guy came and dropped his pants in front of everybody. It was sort of the panoply of I guess what you'd expect in a large city, actually, that suddenly didn't have a real police force. The city looked a lot like this, a lot of bombed out buildings from the initial invasion, trash everywhere because nobody was picking up the trash. So at some point, this is probably in the summer of 2003, the Bremer and the whole coalition authority hired all these out-of-work Iraqis to start cleaning the city. So this is one of those guys who's sweeping up. Sometimes I spent a lot of time walking around Baghdad on my own and just drawing landscapes, cityscapes of Baghdad. And a lot of times if I was starting to draw a large building that was burnt out like this, Iraqis would come up to me and say, "No, mister, no." Like they didn't want their city depicted as being this kind of, ruined city. Other times I'd simply have a crowd of Iraqis around me watching me draw. That was one of the difficult things about drawing in a war zone or drawing in public. I'm an artist that's used to the privacy of my studio. I don't like performing in front of people. And the Iraqi sense of personal space is about like this. So, I really had 6 people touching me, and then people behind them, and all of them commenting in Arabic on every line that I drew. This actually, I managed to escape the crowd in this. I was embedded with a unit that was in Sadr City, so I was perched on top of a Humvee when I drew this. Whenever the soldiers showed up somewhere, the kids would just swirl around. The young boys just loved American military stuff, all the hardware. They loved the soldiers. So for younger kids, soldiers would often throw candy. You'll see a drawing of that. But very quickly it would turn into a chaos, especially in Sadr City, which is this huge Shia slum. It had been called Saddam City. It became the center of the Shia resistance, the Shia insurgency against the occupation. Even at this early stage, things could turn chaotic and really make everybody very nervous very quickly when the soldiers showed up. They would often take razor wire and spread it around their Humvees just to keep people from crowding in. Same place, on top of an Abrams tank. You can see with these drawings, I'm trying to work fast and artistically keep a sort of spontaneity in the work. If I can have some white paper showing, I can do the whole drawing in one session right there while I'm looking at it. It's great. I have a connection with what's happening in front of me, and stuff is moving and changing. Even a simple drawing like this could take easily 45 minutes to do. And so people come into the drawing while I'm doing it, and I can add them. So I can start to shape a narrative as it happens. This is in the summer of 2003, and a huge bomb had gone off in a traffic circle right next to the green zone. You can see the wreckage of it. I didn't have like a reporter's minders and drivers and stuff that would get me to the scene of the accident, or the scene of the crime, the scene of the war zone right away. I kind of ambled over there, got there long after it had happened. The guards wouldn't let me in through the ribbons there, so I just sort of drew what I saw from there, and you can see the smoke in the background. These are Shia marching. This was largely done from photographs. A lot of times I would do a very quick sketch. People are moving so fast. Then I would use photographs as a reference if I wanted to work the thing up more elaborately. This is almost like a mini painting, although it's with watercolor and gouache. This was the first big march of the Shia, who were very concerned about how much power they would get in the upcoming elections. And they didn't want the elections to happen too soon. They wanted time to organize their political parties. Typical market scene. These were great places to draw, other than the fact that, again, I had a peanut gallery around me. But on the other hand, people would also see me drawing. They'd bring me tea. They'd make suggestions for other places to go draw. It was a great way just to meet ordinary, everyday Iraqis. And the other thing that was interesting is, because I was drawing rather than taking photographs, it made it much, much easier for people not to feel threatened by me. I think if I had a camera, all kinds of conspiracy theories were swirling around. They might have thought I was CIA or who knows what. But with a drawing, first of all, there's a performance aspect to it that everybody likes watching, at least if the drawing doesn't totally suck. And they can see things. It's sort of magical as it comes out of the paper. But the other thing is that I'm completely vulnerable. I mean, they can see precisely what I'm doing. There's nothing hidden. There's no hidden agenda. And you can make a lot of friends that way. Typical scene, like I mentioned before, guys throwing. The soldiers, I noticed in situations like this, they always brought candy. They often had candy sent from home that they could throw to the Iraqi kids. I think it was a real pleasure for the soldiers who, they spend a lot of time obviously worrying about security, worrying that bullets are going to start flying. And it's a relief to have kids who are so excited and remind them of kids at home. And so it was something that the kids looked forward to, the soldiers looked forward to. The parents were usually very impassive. They were hanging out at the doorway. They would tolerate their kids doing it, although they by no means welcomed it. I saw examples occasionally on patrols, and especially in Sunni areas, where if the kid was clowning around with an American soldier, the father, who might have been the proprietor of the store, would just whack him really, really hard in the head. It shocked the American soldiers. I mean, Iraqis are very physical, and they kind of fight a lot anyway. I mean, hitting a kid that hard isn't that surprising. But nonetheless, it demonstrated the tension, really graphically. Simple watercolor. Many patrols that I went on, they were looking for suspects, people, especially people that were just building IEDs. These guys were suspected. The car was pulled over. They were arrested. This is a night patrol. Here, I think a shot had just been fired. They took cover. Nothing came of it. They never knew. A lot of shots early on were fired because when there's a patrol at night, the Iraqis are so concerned about looting, they would simply shoot if they heard somebody, just to let any potential robber know that they had a gun. And the Americans would often fire back, and that sometimes resulted in tragic situations, although I never saw that particular civilian casualties from that. This is a weird situation that was very kind of typical for me of the strangeness of Baghdad in 2003, early 2004. After Saddam fell, of course, all of his palaces were looted and all the prisons were looted. And in the prisons, they found these huge collections of films of people being tortured and executed. So there was a whole section of the marketplace where they just sold these kind of horrendous tapes of people being tortured and executed and beaten. And around them, all these men would kind of gather and smoke and watch. Really sinister-looking guys, some of whom looked like they might have been the guys meting out the torture. I didn't feel like hanging around there. So in this case, I took a bunch of photographs and got out of there. And this drawing was composed entirely from many, many photographs that I took. So there were situations where I would just use my own photographs and then Photoshop to put together something that I hoped showed the kind of intensity of things that I saw. That was also typical of situations where there was combat, where it became really impossible to actually draw. Now, the other thing I just want to mention about Baghdad that was neat, I wanted to have some contact with the Iraqis. I didn't just want to be with American soldiers. And the natural way to do that was through Iraqi artists. I was in an embedment with the National Guard unit in Baghdad, and one of the translators was the guy with the beard. His name is Isam Pasha. Isam was going around when there were these all these Saddam murals all over Baghdad that were all defaced as soon as Saddam fell. Isam would make these big, bright, abstract paintings over the murals. And he said, he was translating for this National Guard unit, and we talked for most of a night, and he said, listen, when the embedment's over, meet me at the Shabander Cafe. The Shabander is a famous tea house in Baghdad. It's on Mutanebi Street. This is Mutanebi Street. It's the street of the booksellers. So all of Baghdad's, literary crowds, its intellectual, its artists would hang out on Saturday, the holy day, and peruse the books up and down the street, booksellers everywhere, and then go to the Shabander Cafe that was just packed with people. So I got to meet all of Isam's artist friends. It turned out there were between 1 and 2 dozen galleries, art galleries operating in Baghdad at that time that would have openings. They had sold a lot of work during the period of the embargo, so artists had done very well. Less so now, but still a trickle of sales. And I got to know and spend a lot of time with the artists. When I ran out of art materials, they knew where to go. And I usually felt traveling around Baghdad, I was pretty safe with my friends because they would have a pretty good judge of how things were going, how safe things were. This is Ahmed al-Safi. He's probably one of the most talented artists that I met there. I used to take the bus down to his studio, and we would sometimes paint together. I tried to acquire a little bit of Arabic. I sort of learned enough to tell a taxi driver where I wanted to go. And when I took these buses down to this square, I would shout out what I thought was the right thing. I'd say Nasser, which I thought was, I want to get off. And they always seemed to give me funny looks when I said that. And it turned out what I was actually yelling was victory. This is the Hiwar Gallery, which was probably the best gallery in Baghdad. It was run by a guy named Qasim Septi, who has shown his work occasionally in New York City. A wonderful artist and a wonderful man. He had a club foot. So he was partially lame, but he'd walk around. And I remember somebody asking him about what it was like growing up in Baghdad with a lamed foot. Must have been an Iraqi, because it seems like a tactless question. And he said, oh, it was no problem. I spit really far and really accurately. But Qasim was a wonderful host, and he would serve mas goof, which is a traditional Iraqi fish dish. And you could see it's got a beautiful garden, this gallery. The gallery's behind that, through that gate. This scene didn't last very long, as you can imagine. It really ended somewhere towards the end of 2004, when the insurgency just became too intense, too dangerous. This is a poet friend of mine, Nasir Hassan, a very interesting Shia. He had been a communist, persecuted under Saddam, and was actually very, very pro-George Bush. It was curious, and he'd get into a lot of arguments with other Iraqis over this. But he most of all hated the sort of European leftists that would show up during the sanctions to show common cause with the Baathists, because he felt their eyes were closed by political ideology and they weren't looking around them. So I just show this to say that there was a really interesting spectrum of political views among the Iraqis themselves. Okay, this is Samarra. I want to go through some of the places in the Sunni triangle I was in. Like I say, I wasn't a reporter. I didn't have people that were getting me to the combat zones. My philosophy was kind of to go where I went and draw whatever was happening. And there were good things and there were drawbacks about that philosophy in retrospect. People in New York sometimes accused me of being a booster for the invasion, which I wasn't. But, they felt, one guy told me or said in print, I was a Parisian flaneur in Baghdad. In other words, I was sort of making touristy drawings of what life in Baghdad was like without showing what the worst parts of the war. In my defense, I would say that it wasn't very easy, paradoxically, to get to the war. Usually what the war was an enormous explosion that shook the street, but it was like on the other side of Baghdad. And Iraqis just pretended like it didn't happen. So to be where action was going to happen wasn't easy at all, which is why the news organizations spent a lot of money to have people that could move them around very, very fast. So when I realized I was not where the action seemed to be, I made more of an effort to get into the Sunni triangle. And so Samarra was one of those towns. This is a small base. This drawing is called The Pisser for obvious reasons. There was an American MP unit and an Iraqi police unit. There was a lot of action there, although, again, it wasn't so easy to actually be there when a lot of stuff was happening. But this was shortly after an RPG had been fired at the base, and it had killed the Iraqi who was selling CDs and stuff like that to the soldiers. So both the Americans and the Iraqis were very upset. They sent out an Iraqi squad who came back with a couple of guys that they said had the RPG. Did they? I don't know. Here, these guys are booking them. They took prisoners regularly, and I was told I was allowed to draw them but not photograph them. So I got a chance to draw a lot of prisoners while I was there. This was before Abu Ghraib, so they were still putting the sandbag sacks over their heads, which became obviously a symbol of American insensitivity, so they stopped doing it. But I have to say, it's kind of spectacular to draw. It's a really, it's a striking image to have these hoods. They had such an amazing shape. This is the same base. The MP unit was a small platoon. It was men and women. And in fact, the first time that I realized that women were actively in combat was when I got a ride to their base from another base. And I looked at the gunner, and the gunner's hand was very, very feminine and had a tattoo of, it's like a string of hearts or something like that. And I looked more closely and realized it was a blonde girl who was manning a .50 caliber weapon on the top of the vehicle. So women saw as much combat as men did among that unit. And here you can see it's a woman on the right, a guy who's watching Three Kings, ironically. Everybody was in there together. It was very kind of, again, this mixture of claustrophobic but also sort of cozy. Somewhere between a dorm and, I don't know, Mad Max. This is Ramadi, another town. Ramadi is right next to Fallujah. I never went to Fallujah, but I spent a fair amount of time here at Ramadi, and definitely there was... This is the captain of Alpha Company who's negotiating with one of the sheikhs. There was so much fighting, and the Americans had taken a lot of Iraqis prisoner. And so the local imam, I meant to say imam, not sheikh. The local imam was always trying to negotiate to get prisoners released. And it was always this kind of, the Americans obviously didn't want to release people because they didn't believe that the imam vouching for them was going to be enough. This was an early morning patrol where a roadside bomb went off right next to the Humvee in front of us. I didn't obviously make the watercolor in the seconds that took place. I took a photograph and made the watercolor from the photograph. This was an interesting thing. This was, everybody here's probably heard about the problem of the Humvees not having enough armor. And that was the case here. These guys hired local Iraqis to weld pieces of steel onto the side of their doors just to give them a little bit more protection, but they didn't have any windows. So when I was patrolling, especially after this IED, you've got to sit on the end, and I would sort of sit like this, as far away from the window as possible. This was interesting. We were walking. It was actually with the Puerto Rican National Guard patrol. And we were walking on foot along River Road here. And the platoon sergeant suddenly, I thought arbitrarily, said, "Hey, let's get in the Humvees." So everybody got in the Humvees. And 5 minutes later, the IED went off. The people that had placed the IED had evidently done a very bad job. They'd used an artillery round, and it was at such an angle that it mostly went up at a very steep angle. And so it didn't go into the Humvee, which would have instantly killed everybody inside. This is right after the IED went off. People thought they saw flashes from the palm grove by the river. Everybody was pouring fire into there. These guys swore they were having return fire, but they ran into the grove after emptying their weapons into it, and we found where people had gotten away. We found the trigger mechanism down there, but they got away. Probably, I think maybe a few hours later, somebody showed up with a bullet in their foot at the Army base, which turned out to be an American bullet. So it was clear that they had been part of at least the spotting team that had been there earlier in the day. This is in the base in Ramadi. It rained a lot there. It's cold in Iraq in the wintertime. And now Bakuba, this is this is summer of 2004. I got there thinking this was going to be a really dull embedment. For some reason, I got kind of depressed. I just was looking for the war, and I couldn't find it, again, ironically. And that night, the insurgents took over Bakuba. So I went to the Tactical Operations Center early in the morning to see what they had on the menu. And everybody was milling around. It was crazy. And I heard the news. So I talked my way onto one of these tracked vehicles, which was going to go in. This was an armored battalion. It was an armored engineers battalion. They were going to go in and retake a portion of Bakuba. So this was the only time in all of my trips that I was ever in an actual out-and-out battle. The battle itself probably lasted for no more than an hour. It was a completely one-sided rout. The Americans went in with Abrams tanks and these things, and just they killed a lot of insurgents. I didn't see any dead insurgents because the fighting isn't that close. They're firing across the street and we're moving. However, this was the vehicle. They're here. They're waiting for the order to go in. The smoke on the right is a 500-pound bomb that's been dropped into the stadium in town, where drones, they felt that was the insurgent headquarters. After we got the orders to go in, this was, again, done for photographs. This is where the fighting first started. The insurgents had ambush teams all along this area for a couple of miles, firing IEDs. They had bombs planted and firing machine guns. So, here, this is also from a photograph. These are the people that I was with. I think I was probably so scared that I don't really remember any of this. I was reflexively sticking my camera up. This was a tiny little hatch, and there wasn't room for me to squeeze up there, so I just put the camera up there and snapped pictures. This is from a lot of different photographs just to get this. We were hit with an RPG right after these photographs were taken. And it was just luck that it wasn't an armor-piercing RPG because it hit exactly where I was sitting. It knocked out all of these guys just from the concussion that went over the side of the 113 vehicle. And it knocked out the driver too. He came to. The insurgents fired another RPG round, which was armor-piercing, and this one hit the track, and it went through almost all of it. Later, they showed me the track, which was held together by about an inch of metal, so they were able to keep going. If the insurgents had taken out our vehicle, I think things would have gone very, very differently. So it was really luck. Maybe the guy just reached for the wrong RPG. Again, done from photographs. This is the Sergeant Client who remained concussed, knocked out during the battle. On the way, sort of the second half of the battle, when the fighting had died down, the Americans were trying to keep Iraqis away from the vehicle convoy, and they were firing warning shots at people. And this happened a lot in Iraq. This car didn't stop after the warning shots, so they lit it up, and it burst into flames. And then this woman crawled out of the windshield and died on the road. I was told that she was the wife of the director of electricity in Bakuba, who was an American supporter, and she had her 2 kids in the car, and they were driving to Baghdad to try to escape the fighting. I just saw her. I didn't look inside the car. The gunner in my vehicle swore there weren't any kids inside, but I don't know if he could see, or I don't know if he was telling the truth. Who knows? But this was a recurrent problem for Americans in Iraq. If you're an Iraqi in a car and somebody's firing warning shots, depending on the situation, you might not realize they were warning shots. I mean, it was a really messy, tricky situation, and it was terrible for the guys too. This is Sergeant Kennedy, who was in the vehicle that ordered the firing to stop that vehicle, and of course he and the other people felt terrible about it. But they also understood. I should say that they had gotten intelligence before this battle that there were going to be car bombs. So they had reason to think that somebody would try to blow them up. A view from the base in Bakuba. Every American base had Iraqi kids that would hang out at the gate. They're not locked up. They're just on the outside. And they would run errands for the soldiers. They'd buy them CDs or music stuff or even food from the local economy. And they were kind of they were like adopted by the soldiers in a way. Some soldiers suspected they might be getting intelligence for the insurgents, which is possible. But in any case, it was a relationship that I saw again and again in many bases. This was a prison where insurgents and other criminals were being held. These are people visiting the prison during visiting hours. There's the prison. It was interesting to draw because everybody crowded up. They wanted their portraits done while I was making these drawings. And you can see the guy in the lower left is holding up a picture of his family that he wanted me to include in the drawing. And then all the prisoners wanted me to hold up my sketchbook and run through all the drawings I had done. It sort of felt like they wanted to see what the outside world was like again and see something new. View of Bakuba, a woman walking down the street. These are guys it's an anti-mortar squad looking for insurgent mortars. Drawing like this, I had enough time to do the drawing and add the color while I was there. Ubiquitous. This is an artillery crew killing time. It's mostly what they do. This is Haifa Street in Baghdad, another nasty neighborhood. It had really been taken over by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was an Arkansas National Guard unit which was there along with the 1st Cavalry Regiment. Whenever they went into town, it seemed like they got attacked. They would always go in Bradley fighting vehicles because it was so dangerous, and then they'd dismount once they were where they wanted to be, often accompanied by helicopters going around providing air cover. When I was with them and they would arrive somewhere and there was nobody on the street, you knew there was going to be trouble. Haifa Street has a lot of tall buildings that Saddam built for Ba'ath Party members. The insurgents used them as sniper nests. They could hide snipers up in the towers, and because of the echoing up between the towers, it was very hard to tell where shooting was coming from. And the Americans had their own snipers, so it was a constant sniper versus sniper battle. The snipers took their helmets off because they rode down over their eyes, which made them vulnerable too. Towers overlooked each other, so it was always felt very risky to be up there. I did this drawing very quickly, lying as low as the snipers were. These were the Bradley vehicles that the soldiers would ride into Haifa Street with. This also done later from photographs, a firefight going on in Haifa Street. This particular day, it was a long mission. The area was completely deserted when we got there, so again, I mean, they had a feeling they were going into trouble. I don't know what intelligence they had. But shortly after this happened, there were shots being fired from the insurgent snipers. And then we heard over the radio one KIA, one American killed in action, who was a block away from us. And he was a guy named Specialist Josiah Vander Tulip, who was actually, I think he was with the engineers. He had volunteered to go along on the mission, as a lot of people did that were not regular line soldiers, just to help flesh out their ranks. So he was killed, and these guys right here are getting ready to run forward to the building where they thought the Iraqi sniper was. I made the drawing while I was with them, waiting for the order to go forward, and then filled it in with color later. They never found any evidence of the sniper. And the other thing is that Vander Tulip, even though he was killed a block away from me, I never saw his body. And there again, it was one of these things where I was aware, the war was close to me. I was aware that it was happening. I was able to draw sort of things around it, but I couldn't draw the body because I couldn't see it. And this was sort of, in my experience, sort of the nature of it. It was very rare that I ever saw an actual body. It was mostly a lot of shooting and smoke and noise. This was not for Vander Tulip. This was for a guy who was killed the week before I got to this unit, a guy named Hennessy, who was very popular. When a soldier is killed, they have a memorial service where they take his helmet and his boots, they stick the rifle in it like that, and his buddies come up and talk about him. And it's very, very emotional, as you can imagine. And then they play taps, and they have a roll call of everybody in the unit. So as they say each name, the person says present, and then they get to the name of the guy that was killed, and there's a silence. And they call his name 2 more times to silence, and then that's it. And it's I was crying when I was making this drawing. It's very, very emotional ceremony, and a way, I think, of closure. This is the Baghdad ER, which was probably the most emotional part of all of my trips. I spent almost a month there. It's kind of like the TV show MASH. They get a call, helicopters coming in. They come in with the casualties. You can see the guy with these little modified golf carts that race them over to the ER. These are the stretchers. They're often bloody. They're washed here. They're out to dry in the backyard. You can see more helicopters in the background. This is a very typical scene. I found that usually there was a certain emotional remove from me because I was trying so hard to make a drawing with all of these doctors and nurses in front of me. So to kind of parse out what is going on, where is the person, what are they doing, you sort of constantly have to move around to try to look. People would often ask me to pass stuff, so it's a very, things happen fast and it's chaotic. I also had to learn, again, to decide for myself that I needed to be there. Because when there was what they called a mass cash situation, it's mass casualty, if a bomb went off and they had 6 victims, the place would be, all the beds were full, the place was flooded with doctors and nurses, and an officer would march in and say, all non-essential personnel need to leave right now. And the first time he walked in and said that, I decided I'd designate myself an essential person. And they didn't ask me to leave. And I realized if I didn't do that, I wouldn't get any work done. They told me at the beginning their pact was I could do whatever I wanted, draw whatever I wanted, but not insurgents who they were treating because of the Geneva Convention, and nothing in the morgue. However, I was certainly allowed to draw people who died in the ER. It's a typical operating room scene. People would come in with their bodies intact but bloody, and within an hour they'd have 2 or 3 limbs amputated. The reason being that an IED shatters all the bones, and even if you can theoretically keep the limb, you'll never walk on it. It'll always get infected. Whereas if you amputate it, even a double amputee can learn to run. You can have a more of a versatile lifestyle. But I saw limbs all over the place. Here they are operating an Iraqi boy who was it shrapnel or bullet wound in his leg. Now, this was a little Iraqi boy who was, he came in with several children from Ramadi, and the insurgents at that time were exploding trucks that had canisters or barrels of chlorine. Chlorine they use a lot for cleaning in Iraq. And when they'd explode the trucks, it would atomize the chlorine. So everybody nearby would breathe it, and it would destroy their lungs. They didn't know the boy's name, so they called him Henry. He survived, but the kids that he came in with didn't. Henry was always unhappy, always crying, and the doctors and nurses in their off periods between whatever operations would come in and hold him. And I always felt like they were comforting themselves as much as they were trying to comfort Henry, because these guys and gals they absorb, so much hurt. A lot of Iraqis were treated. They probably, in this small hospital, I'd say 60%, if not more, were Iraqis, both soldiers and civilians who were nearby when soldiers brought them in. Here's a woman who's tending to her child, and there's an American soldier in the background. There's a little Iraqi boy. There's an American soldier whose foot was blown off. This was a mass cash event. You'd see strange things. In this case, the guy was, probably in shock, and he kept on repeating, "I yelled at my wife, I yelled at my wife," talking about the last conversation he had with her, not sure if he was going to live. This was a guy whose jaw, he had various wounds. His jaw was partly blown off. Here he is in the operating room. They had an amazing, incredible staff, a lot of them volunteers from hospitals in the U.S. who were experts at reconstructive surgery, as well as every specialty you can imagine. Really, really hardcore guys, docs. Here they're trying to reconstruct his jaw. Here he is recovering, and a couple of his buddies have come to visit. Of course, I always ask permission before doing drawings like that. This was a guy who came in in a mass casualty event. He was intact, but badly damaged internally from the concussion from a bomb. I drew him and then followed him up to the operating room. They worked on him I stayed for it was late, maybe 3 hours. They continued to operate on him. I heard the next day that he died in the early morning. There's another soldier that died. When they would start to try to do CPR, it usually meant that he wasn't going to make it because there was heart failure. They would cut open his rib cage and try to massage the heart directly. And I asked them if it ever worked. They said it worked once or twice, but then the person died later. Some of the sketches are just very, very simple. I just put down the date or the time when they were pronounced dead. And this is loading him onto a body bag. They will keep on working on a soldier until a doctor comes and formally pronounces him dead. This is the kind of thing that obviously takes a toll. When somebody dies, they bring their body to the morgue, which is it's a refrigerated container unit. A lot of times, if a unit is hit in Baghdad, near the hospital, they will drive to the hospital just, very, very quickly. And in this case, their buddy died. So the unit hangs out outside this morgue, and it's called guarding the body. And they hang out and talk, console, shoot the shit, smoke cigarettes, try to grieve. And they're waiting for this, which is called the angel flight. This is something that is not, reporters were not allowed to film this. But since I was drawing, they said, you can definitely draw it. The body is brought out in this sort of formal procession, and if his unit is with him, they line up, or the doctors and nurses that treated him before he died. They stand at attention while the body is brought to the helicopter, which takes his body to Balad and then on to Dover. I'm just going to wrap up with a few. Mark mentioned the history paintings that I'm working on. It's sort of the larger project. By history paintings, for those of you that don't know, these are usually large, ambitious pictures which tell a story of some sort of significant event. A famous example in the Louvre is called the Raft of the Medusa, and it's a whole bunch of people in a raft in stormy seas. One of them is kind of on top waving a rag, trying to get somebody's attention to be rescued. This was a big political event in France back in the 19th century. Rembrandt, all the painters from the Baroque era, Velázquez, was a very common kind of thing to do. But history painting doesn't always have to be so large and so specific. One of my artistic mentors was Winslow Homer, and he did a painting that's in the Met that is one of my favorites. I think it's called The Reaper, and what it is, it's a guy in a field in the 1870s. He looks like your average American farmer. He's in a field of wheat, and he has a scythe, and he's just cutting the wheat. And you can see, a very simple painting, and you can see to one side is his jacket that he's thrown onto the wheat, and it's an old Union jacket. Or not really that old, but I mean, it's his Union jacket. And so people that saw the painting understood that he had been a Union soldier, and now he was going back to his farm and working on his farm. The reason that I call that a history painting is that it's more than just a story about a farmer. It's also about the end of war and putting weapons away. It's kind of the old, turning swords into plowshares. It becomes a metaphor for a nation healing after a war. So history painting talks about events that involve all of us and move us emotionally. These are my first attempts in a way. One of them is upstairs. If you see the show, I hope you will. This is one that is based on my time in the Baghdad ER. It's quite a large painting. It's around 8 feet tall, maybe even a little bit more than that. To do these paintings, because I didn't have that much information from the drawings, I hired models. So I bought clothing that seemed appropriate. I used a lot of my photographs as source material, and then I would pose them. I actually had one session where I put all of them together like this. And what often happens in these kind of photo shoots is that the models begin to feel their roles very emotionally. Because they're in costume, and because I tell them a little bit about what the story was that they're doing, they kind of reinforce each other. And a lot of them often say afterwards that they find the experience of posing for these shoots moving in the very way that the story that I'm describing. So I feel almost like a kind of performance art before I make the actual painting. This is a very large painting. I think it's about 16 feet wide. This was kind of a panorama of the battle that I described in Bakuba. I was in that vehicle that's kind of in the center right. This is a series of many things that happened over the course of several hours, all put together in this, kind of 180-degree view. So it's an artificial thing. There was no one time when it looked like this, and frankly, a lot of it just looked like smoke anyway. But this is putting it all together to kind of illustrate what the battle was in terms of all the things that happened. I mentioned before about the guys going onto Haifa Street, crammed into this Bradley. The title of this painting is "Going Back In." This is also large. I think it's about 7.5 feet wide. So the figures are larger than life size. And I wanted to get that sense of both the claustrophobia, but also the tension. Going back in, through the title, it implies they've already been out. By out, I mean outside the wire. And now something has happened, which is calling them back in. So they're ready to be shot at and to shoot back. And you can see it, I hope, in the kind of tension in their bodies and the way that the officer on the right is looking out that tiny little window, trying to figure out where they are, when they're going to get there. This is a different kind of scene, sandstorm in Tikrit. The Iraqi sandstorms are amazing. It's like a rainstorm but with sand. In this case, I actually threw real sand on the wet paint to kind of get that grainy effect. I remember this night, it was a combination of strange and also sort of beautiful because nobody was shooting at us, and it was like everybody was in boats at night. There was something that was kind of I think I used the word cozy before. It's odd to use that word, but it sort of felt that way. And part of the coziness is the camaraderie that I often felt among the American soldiers. For them, their unit becomes like their larger family. And that was something that I found beautiful and wanted to address. Now, I'm about to wrap up, and I just want to say, to make it sort of clear, that I never thought of myself as a reporter. And what I mean by that is I never thought I was objective. I wasn't going there to get any true story. I wasn't going there to tell the truth about Iraq. I wasn't going there to protest the war, and I wasn't going there to say that war is bad. My only interest was to say what war was like, and then to be true to my own feelings, my subjective feelings, about whoever I happened to be with, whether it was Americans or my Iraqi friends. I certainly never embedded with insurgent forces, and I wouldn't have been interested in doing that. So that was my mission, and that's why I don't feel uncomfortable about talking about what I liked about the U.S. Army or about being with Americans. I did sometimes see Americans behave badly, and it's something that I've sometimes touched on in the drawings. I think I'll touch more on it in the future. But by and large, what I felt like over all these trips and all these different units that I was with, most of the soldiers were trying to make the best of a bad situation, trying to maintain their dignity, trying to somehow do right by the Iraqis. And when they messed up, it was usually it was an accident of some sort. It was, very rarely did I feel maliciousness on their part. So, of course, that happened. Abu Ghraib was Abu Ghraib, and I would never apologize for what happened there. I think that was a travesty. That stuff happens in war, and civilian casualties happen. And sometimes the civilian casualties happen out of an unavoidable accident. Sometimes they happen because somebody panics. And you understand why they panicked. If somebody fires a bullet when there's an oncoming car, and the car hasn't stopped because you fired a warning shot, at what point do you stop just firing warning shots? I think some of the best soldiers I ever saw really could keep on not shooting into the car. They could really hold their fire until they absolutely were certain. But we don't all have that kind of control. And I can't fully condemn somebody that doesn't, because, who among us would know that we could? It was a difficult position that the soldiers were put in to be sent to Iraq. I think this is the last thing. This is an interesting painting for me. I got to know a reporter who was head of the AP photo bureau in Baghdad, and he invited me to a barbecue at one of the expensive hotels. I had been to a breakfast at the same hotel with my friend Ahmed, and he recognized one of these girls who was kind of hanging around the cafeteria. And he said, "Oh yeah, I heard she was a prostitute, working as a prostitute in this hotel." The hotel was pretty much exclusively Westerners, and media for that matter. There may have been contractors too. And that surprised me, because in Iraqi, there's plenty of prostitution in Baghdad, like every city, but it's not like the stories of Vietnam where they're servicing American soldiers. It's a huge, 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 huge taboo for an Arab woman to have any sort of sexual relations or even close relations with a Westerner. So these girls, this girl, and it turned out these girls, were taking a huge risk. If they ever left the green zone and got in an Iraqi taxi or anything like that, they would be marked for execution, and a gruesome execution at that, because of the job they did. So in my mind, I speculated that probably they had hoped that they'd thrown their lot in with the Westerners and that somebody would take them out, take them to the West when they left. I saw them in the swimming pool during this barbecue, and the two girls were in the middle of the pool. It was at dusk. And I just had this overwhelming sense of loneliness. And it struck me when I mentioned before about metaphor being a part of history painting. Their choice to be prostitutes and service these Westerners in this Western enclave. It was a hotel, by the way, that had a security perimeter around it. It was very, very guarded. Every civilian is faced with a choice when they're in a war zone of what they're going to do for their survival. Do they become a translator for the Americans and hope the Americans will protect them? Do they become friends with the insurgents, help the insurgents, figuring the insurgents will win? Do they try to be neutral and not help either side and risk bullets from both sides? do they try to get out of the country and risk crossing the border and all that? So their choice was like the choice that all civilians make, and theirs was a risky one. And I felt there was that notion was sort of in the beauty of the composition. Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. It's very practical. I wonder what size of a sketchbook you could manage standing around drawing in the street like that.
Yeah, that's a good. I like to work on a larger sketch pad if I can. If I'm embedded, then I'm wearing a flak jacket and a helmet, so I have to, and it's bulky. So I have to have something that I can still hold my ink or watercolors and the sketch pad all with one hand. So that limited the height to about like that at the most, maybe. So yeah, I was very aware of that and would plan everything ahead of time to cut the sketch pad down to size. Sure.
Your choice of color, some pictures had it, some pictures didn't, some figures had color and others didn't. Is there a method, or was it just what looked right?
Yeah, I guess what looked right. Sometimes, if I had a lot of time, it seemed like a luxury, and then it felt like, why not add color, while I was drawing from the subject. But other times, sometimes you get a simple sepia drawing, and it's working, so why screw it up, And sometimes I felt like when I went back, I added a lot of interesting detail, but it's also easy to overwork a drawing like that. Since this is a somewhat documentary situation, maybe adding the detail isn't so bad. But if I had something that seemed to be working in a simple state, I would often try to save it just like that. The other thing about materials is pen and ink is my preferred medium. I like to go directly in with ink, no pencil or anything ahead of time. Ink dries really quick, especially in the Iraqi sun. So it's a really practical medium to use. And likewise, the washes, everything is right away, almost the minute it hits the paper. And watercolors were useful like that too. Whereas obviously something like oil would be completely impractical. Yes?
I'm glad you ended with a picture of a sandstorm. It's such a great metaphor for Iraq that, 1 minute you're there and you can see everything, and the next minute everything disappears.
Right.
But it sort of stands in for the whole situation. I was there in 08 and 09, and I went to visit the former Minister of Culture,
Right.
abstract art, which
Yeah.
is what the Iraqis were really known for loving and excelling at.
Right.
The interpreter who was with me, who was an Iraqi, who hadn't been gone from Iraq for that long, he gave us a sort of a lecture about how the Iraqis' appreciation for art had been ruined by Saddam Hussein over the years. And then he walked out of the room and she turned to me and she said, and he said, Iraqis are sort of, primitive now. They don't appreciate art. And she turned to me and she said, I don't know why anybody would buy these pictures of nothing, but he's right about the Iraqis. So, did you get that sense? I mean, you were there, you were an artist.
Yeah.
Did they lose? They used to be that. Did they lose it?
Well, not precisely. I think it's more complicated than that. And this is, it's funny because it touches on their relationship with me as an artist. When you go to Iraqi galleries, you see almost all abstraction in the front room. And then either in the back room or upstairs, you see a lot of representational work, which is, literally takes a back seat to abstraction. Now, when I talked to young Iraqi artists, most of them didn't know who Andy Warhol was. And the thing that Saddam and the Ba'ath Party did is they simply cut Iraq off from the rest of the world, and especially the West, so that Iraqi artists, what they were familiar with was European modernism. And what they were really looking at was Picasso, Matisse, and Miro, and artists like that from that era. And I simply think that all the developments, especially conceptualism and postmodernism, had never gotten to Iraq because artistically they'd been closed down since then. And that also was odd because here I was, this Western artist who, in theory should have been bringing like the new, and I was doing this 19th century sort of going around and drawing on the street. And so I think in a way they didn't quite know what to make of me. But there was another thing that was going on in Iraq, which was in the Ba'athist era, Iraq had strong ties with the Soviet Union. So a lot of Iraqi artists went to Moscow and trained with Moscow academicians in Soviet socialist realism. So there was an older generation of artists in their 40s and 50s who were teaching at the academy, who, in my opinion, were doing beautiful realist work, not sort of really tight realism, actually, somewhat more expressionistic, but very much about Iraqi society. There was an older couple, in fact, both the man and the wife were artists, both doing interesting work on their own. His work was mostly about women, nudes, but from an Iraqi tribal perspective. Iraqi tribes use a lot of tattoos, and tattoos on women are a real mark of sexiness and beauty. And so he did these lovely, so Matisse-like, but very much his own style, pictures of these tribal people and the tribal women. Very mysterious and beautiful. His wife also did portraits of women, but much more with a humorous, critical eye towards Arab society. And I really regret not buying one of her paintings. I posted all my work on artnet.com. I had a small satellite dish. And one story I did was about the art scene in Baghdad. And I ended it with, this would be a great time for collectors to come to Baghdad and collect Iraqi art. This was probably summer of 2003. I met a British tourist in Baghdad who told me he had gone water skiing on the Tigris and then gotten terribly, terribly sick from the polluted water. I don't know if it was true, but you could have. I mean, Baghdad was weird, and somebody could do a wonderful book or a movie about what it was like in the early part of the occupation before the insurgency really got going. Anyway, I just totally lost my train of thought. But
They're modernist. They're stuck in that. They're,
well, I think not anymore. As soon as everything fell, the internet cafes opened up everywhere, and this was a brand new thing. And you couldn't go to these internet cafes and use them without having porn all over the desktop that young boys had downloaded. But the larger point is that everybody that had an interest was exploring. So art, and now, I mean, by the time Abu Ghraib happened, Iraqi artists were already starting to make installations. So this stuff changes very, very quickly. And installation in the larger Arab contemporary art world, installation and photography and video are big. So these are changing. But definitely, all of my young artist friends that I met in Iraq were working in this late modernist kind of language. And so when you went to galleries, you would see stuff that would range from really, really kitschy, like stuff you'd buy at an airport in a third world country, to really beautiful and original, but very much, something that in the West you would have expected would have been painted in 1953. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That it was in black and white. And there's a lot of discussion over, and I've heard what you said today, but even if them express to you how they reacted to that.
Yes. And Jeanma, thank you for bringing all those people over and for bringing that up. It was very moving yesterday. There were a lot of vets that came by and looked at the show and that I talked to briefly. Several people, I think, were brought back to things that they hadn't thought about by looking at some of the drawings. The memorial service is something that probably most vets that served in Iraq saw at one time or another, and especially like the line soldiers and stuff. I think that in my experience, most people don't get too specific about how they feel. Instead, if people feel something from my work, they'll just come up and tell me, thanks, I got something from it, or I felt something from it, and I feel like that's enough. I'm sure there's a role that art could play in therapy. Obviously, PTSD is major issue that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. I feel like, the Army really ought to have an art program where vets learn basic drawing and painting. I think making paintings about about their experiences in Iraq could be a way that people that have a visual bent could explore their own feelings about their deployments. So, but yesterday was great. One vet did ask me, he said, with that one, I could have painted the American flag in color and left the rest of it just in sepia, which is definitely, that would have made a point. But I feel like the American flag is such you get it right away, whenever you see those stars, and all it takes is those stars and maybe one stripe, and instantly you know what it is. So it's sort of a potent symbol. Any other questions? Well, thanks a lot, and feel free to come up and ask me if you have anything to say.